Hello, I'm Valerie Reid, and today I'd like to read a chapter to you from this wonderful memoir by Rick Bragg called All Over But the Shoutin'. Rick Bragg grew up dirt poor in rural Alabama, and he seemed destined for either the cotton mill or the penitentiary, but instead he became a Pulitzer Prize winning writer for the New York Times. This memoir it tells the story of his growing up, but it also tells many of the stories he covered. And the one I'm going to read today is a true story. It's a very sad story. It happened on Palm Sunday in 1994. And although it is heart-wrenching, I hope that the sense of hope and the testimony to the human spirit will shine through as Rick Bragg, I'm sure, intended. Chapter 31, Coming Home. You hear them more than you see them. People always say they sound like freight trains rumbling across the sky, and maybe that is it exactly. We hunkered down in hallways or storm shelters 3 or 4 times a year when I was a boy, waiting for the tornadoes to go away. Mama prayed. I saw only one my whole life, a fat gray snake writhing in the sky over the Crystal Springs community not far from home. I tried not to be afraid, but I was. I lost my fear of them over time. In my adult life, the bad winds were just one more story written about strangers. The names were strange names. The dead were benignly alien to me. I wish it had stayed that way. It was Palm Sunday, 1994, in the New York Times newsroom. The Associated Press moved a story that a tornado had destroyed a church in northeastern Alabama, toppling a wall onto its congregation, killing 20 people, including 6 children. The dateline read Piedmont, the town where I was born. The editors on the national desk asked me if I would be the rewrite man on the information coming in. First, I called my mama to make sure she and my kinfolk were fine, and they were. Then I wrote about death in my backyard. I knew the names. I knew the place. I knew the color of the ground and the smell of the grass and the height of the trees. It was not a good story, just another story about dying in the paper of record. It didn't mention the small patent leather children's shoes scattered in the ruin. Brand new Easter shoes bought especially for church, for that day. For some reason, I thought not about the rubble and the dying, but about mamas, leading toddlers through the dollar store or the Walmart, searching for the perfect shoes. I wanted to do more than give a body count punctuated by a few quotes. It deserved more than that. The next day I flew to Atlanta, rented a car, and went home to the little community that straddled the Calhoun-Cherokee County line. It was a brilliant, beautiful day, and if you didn't see the tin from old roofs wrapped like foil in the branches of trees, if you didn't notice blank spaces on the spring grass where houses were supposed to be, you would have thought everything was just fine. As I drove too fast toward the church, a man in a pickup waved at me, and I forgot to wave back. The city does change you. People who believe I was just speeding to another compelling story are dead wrong. Any reporter who has had to write about his or her own people, like the reporters who covered the bombing in Oklahoma City, will tell you that they do so with great reluctance, but knowing they might do the story better than a stranger. I found instead of a church, a pile of sticks and crushed red brick with a scrawny cross made from scrap stuck up in its center. People pulled their cars and pickups over to the side of the road and walked up to look at it. I remembered that men took their hats off. I remember there were still some buttercups out, and that the rain had turned the red clay to slick mud. It was why no one I ever knew had white carpet. That mud, it was harder to get out than bloodstains. I looked at it for a while, then did my job. I talked to the survivors. I jotted names I didn't have to ask to spell and ages I didn't really need. I had played softball against their nephews, gone to school with their sons and daughters, and probably waved at every one of them at one time or another as my car met their car on a strip of blacktop. I found them troubled by more than grief. You do not die in church in northeastern Alabama. You do not die under the eye of God, under his hand in his house. You cannot. Later, when I asked Mama what people were saying and how they made sense of it, she just sat there with not much to say. Others I asked wouldn't look me in the face. I guess what I sensed was not anger, but doubt. As I stood just outside the crime scene tape, a crime of nature, I guess, that ringed the pitiful pile of rubble, I tried like I always do to recreate the thing in my mind, to see it. The survivors had filled my head with it. The destruction of the little country church and the deaths, including the pastor's 4-year-old daughter, had taken just a second, maybe 2. The children had been putting on a play, and in the middle of praising his name, 6 of the little ones and 14 grown-ups were crushed to death. Most of them died instantly. There had been screams of pain and fear, and some merely shifted the direction of their prayers, like a car changing gears on a hill. There had been almost no warning, just those uneasy glances at the winds pounded the walls. But where better to be in a storm than here? They are country people, so instead of lying helpless, they tried to help each other. The wounded were carried off on stretchers fashioned from the splintered pews. In a makeshift morgue in the National Guard Armory in Piedmont, volunteers wiped the faces of the dead children before zipping up the body bags. The bags were too long and had to be rolled up from the bottom. Outside, grown, tough men sobbed into the arms of other men who held them like babies. The funerals lasted all week in the surrounding towns, and obituaries filled an entire page in the local newspaper. No one died. People merely said that God took them. He took Ms. Ruth Peake, 64, and Mr. Cicero Peake, 72. He took Derek Watson, who died with his wife Glenda Kay and their daughter Jessica. Everyone knew Derek. He worked at the Super Value. He took 4-year-old Hannah Clem, the pastor's daughter, and Earl Abbott, whose wife played the organ. Earl's brother was the one, Rudy, who coached baseball and told me that people like me and him couldn't fail. I learned from my mama and kin that 2 other churches were destroyed during services, but those congregations somehow survived. The winds had snapped 200-year-old trees and ruined houses and lives in 5 states that day, but Goshen was the centerpiece of the agony. The same winds had ravaged Spring Garden, Rock Run, Possum Trot, Benefield's Gap, Knighton's Crossroad, and Webster's Chapel. At Mount Gilead Church, about 10 miles from Goshen, the wind had pulled tombstones from the earth and smashed them to pieces. I knew that over 2 counties there would be pickle jars on the counter of stores filled with quarters and wadded up dollar bills for the victims' families. The funerals would be a hardship for many of them, the children of farmers, mill workers, seamstresses, carpenters, and steel workers, some who had moved on to other work, some who stood in the places where their fathers and mothers had stood, at sewing plants and cotton mills. The mill, I knew, had just had a new round of layoffs. I went to the funeral home one night myself, half as reporter, half as a man whose obligation it is to be there. The line in the door was 50 yards long, and as I walked by, people would throw up an arm and say, "Hey, boy, where you been?" I shook a dozen hands and hugged a man whose name I could not really remember. Maybe he had gotten fat, or I had grown stupid. Later, in the dark parking lot, I jotted down what they said, what they felt. The people said the same thing. How awful, how sad, and how hard to understand. We were trained from birth not to question God, one young woman, Robin Tucker King, told me. I met her outside the funeral home where the cars half filled the parking lot of the nearby football field. "But why?" she said. "Why a church? Why those little children? Why? Why?" It was a church, Jerry Kearns, delivering flowers to the funeral home, said. It isn't supposed to happen in the church. I ran into Sam Goss on my way to the car. Everyone knows Sam, too. He runs the filling station and believes in heaven the same way he believes that walking in the Coosa River will get him wet. He smoked a cigarette, cried some, and talked about glory. "It's hard not to question God in this," he said, "but they say there ain't no tears in heaven. We're the ones left to hurt. You see, God took them because he knew they were ready to go. He's just given all the rest of us a second chance." I don't know for sure if anyone in that little town of 5,000 or so ever shook their fist at God. I don't know for sure how many felt their faith slip away from them in the dark nights after that awful thing. But I doubt if it is many. Life can be hard here without some faith. I remember what Vera Stewart, Piedmont's 70-year-old mayor, told me when I called her about the tragedy. Piedmont, she reminded me, has 2 doctors' offices and 20 churches. As long as we have our faith, we are as strong as our faith, Mrs. Stewart said, because no matter how dark it is, if I have faith, I have a song in the night. The minister of the Goshen church, the Reverend Kelly Clem, took a few minutes to talk to me beside the ruins of her church. I remember feeling a great surprise that the minister of a little country church in my part of the world was a woman. I hadn't known we had gotten so progressive. When I saw her, her face was covered with bruises from the falling bricks, and her eyes had that weary look that would have been hopelessness if something inside, or from on high, had not been propping her up. She had spent all her time since the disaster ministering to the grieving parishioners, to the heartsick. You hate this part. As a reporter, you hate to look into the eyes of a woman who has seen her child taken away forever. But maybe even worse, I felt like I was insulting her, her beliefs, to ask for an explanation for this disaster in a sacred, holy place. She just smiled at me a little wearily. "This might shake people's faith for a long time," said Mrs. Clem. "I think that is normal. But having your faith shaken is not the same as losing it." She explained that God did not send the storm that killed their daughter. She explained to me the distinction between God's laws and the laws of nature, something theologians have debated for years. "My God is a God of hope," she said. And her husband, Dale Clem, also a minister, said it is never his will for anyone to die. I had been taught as a child that he controlled everything, even the wind. At the funeral for the Clem's daughter, the presiding minister told the congregation that it was okay to be confused People have asked, why did it happen in a church, said the Reverend Bobby Green. There is no reason. Our faith is not determined by reason. Our faith is undergirded by belief when there is no reason. In the Bible, Palm Sunday is a day of destruction, not hope, he said. Hope comes later on Easter Sunday. As I stood with the mourners and said the Lord's Prayer, the only one I knew all the way through. It was my first time home as the big shot newspaper reporter, the New York Times guy, but few people knew that or even cared. They had lost track of me a few papers ago. They asked me how I liked Birmingham and if I was still married. When I told them I was a New York Times reporter now, they looked at me funny. I'm sure that a few of them thought I was lying or crazy. I wrote my story at the Galveston Times, just a short drive away. The New York Times owned it now, like me, and the nice people there let me write my story there. The Galveston Times had just gotten in a new chair, one of those very fancy, ergonomically correct jobs with more adjustments than a barber's chair. They insisted that I take it since I was visiting. It was a fine chair. I wrote the story over 2 days. It was important to me that it be good. I guess because I wanted people there to think well of me, but also because it was my responsibility. I was one of them. Nothing that had ever happened over all the years I had been away had changed that. I begun it this way. This is a place where grandmothers hold babies on their laps under the stars and whisper in their ears that the lights in the sky are holes in the floor of heaven. This is a place where the song Jesus Loves Me has rocked generations to sleep, and heaven is not a concept, but a destination. Yet in this place where many things, even storms, are viewed as God's will, people, strong in their faith and their children, have died in, of all places, a church. The destruction of this little country church and the deaths, including the pastor's vivacious 4-year-old daughter, have shaken the faith of many people who live in this deeply religious corner of Alabama, about 80 miles northeast of Birmingham. It is not that it has turned them against God, only that it has hurt them in a place usually safe from hurt, like a bruise on the soul. I flew back to Manhattan on Saturday and met some reporter friends for a late dinner at a Cuban joint on Broadway uptown. As we ate, talking about worthless stuff that reporters are expert at, I noticed a young man, he had to be a student, eating alone at a counter and reading an early copy of the Sunday Times. The story was there on the front page with a picture of that raggedy cross and a headline that said something about an anchor of faith holding. I asked him if I could see it, and he said something to the effect of "get your own." So I read over his shoulder to the jump. "I wrote that," I said. He didn't bother to turn around. But the fact is that I didn't give a damn what he thought of it. Over the next few weeks, I would learn that editors back home reran the story in the Alabama papers. For weeks, months, people wrote me letters from strangers, letters from home. It wasn't that I had gotten it right. God knows I mess up a lot, but that I had gotten it true. I was back there less than a year later in the false spring we always get during February. The congregation stood not in a church, but as I wrote, in the promise of one. They sang Amazing Grace in a green field speckled with red anthills. And I noticed it was hard to tell when people were praying and when they were just checking their feet. I saw some grown men cry. I saw people I knew and people who were alone who should not have been. I saw gaps in families. They had come to this old cornfield just a mile or so from the site of the old church to start over and consecrate the ground. One by one, starting with the children, they poured cups of red dirt from the old site and mixed it into the clay of the new one. Of the more than 80 parishioners who were injured, most have healed. A few, like 50-year-old Joyce Woods, whose foot was crushed, still hobble. For her and the others, Sunday's service was a time of celebration and joy, said her husband, Franklin. It was the first time I had ever seen the Reverend Clem when her face had not been swollen and purple. She spoke beside a rough-hewn cross, held together by a rusty nail. It was the same cross that parishioners stuck into the church rubble the day after the tornado hit. Pictures of that cross rising from the destruction have appeared in newspapers and magazines around the world. When the service ended, she asked the children in the congregation to join her at the altar of grass for a surprise. She asked them if there were any children in heaven they wanted to send a message to. One little boy nodded his head. Together, they opened a plastic bag full of brightly colored helium balloons and turned them loose. The balloons rose into the pale blue sky. The pastor's other daughter, 3-year-old Sarah, watched them fly. It is nice to believe that balloons can rise so high. Patricia Abbott, Earl's widow, played the church organ in the middle of a field of new grass.